So now we get to number 6 on our list of ability scores. Doing our deep dive, we get to charisma, the last one on the list. Now with charisma, I usually categorize it as one of the mental ability scores. You have the physical ones being strength, dexterity, and constitution, and the mental ones being intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. But I have to say that categorizing never really satisfied me, because charisma is not exactly a mental ability. And so I think it's more in a class by itself. But regardless, let's look at 3rd edition. First, of course, we got, starting off, we have our skills. There are 8 skills keyed to charisma in 3rd edition. We have bluff, diplomacy, disguise, gather information, handle animal, intimidate, perform, and use magic device. 8 skills, which we will go into more depth on these skills in a later video, but these 8 skills are key to your charisma. In addition, it mentions here that there are additional checks made to influence others that are not covered by these 8 skills. Now, most of them will probably be covered by things like diplomacy or bluff, but there are some checks in 3rd edition that are made to influence others that are not covered by the skills, but would still be modified by charisma. And then you also have this listing that clerics and paladins, their turn undead ability in 3rd edition is modified by charisma. So even though they use wisdom for their spells, there are some abilities that they have that are modified by charisma, and the turn undead is one of them. Then we have the classes that use charisma as their spell casting ability, and in 3rd edition we have 2 classes. We have the bard and the sorcerer. We have 8 skills, any other check to influence others, and turn undead, and then these 2 classes that use charisma as their spellcasting ability. Now let us look at 5th edition. Again, let's start with the skills, because that's what's listed first. We have deception, intimidate, perform, and persuasion. 4 skills, 8 skills. But again, just like other skills, they don't necessarily translate perfectly. So deception, as it's described, would be a combination of bluff and disguise from 3rd edition. It's anytime you're trying to fool somebody. Telling a lie, trying to pass yourself off in disguise, all that is covered in deception, which is split in the 2 skills of bluff and disguise in 3rd. Intimidation, however, is basically the same thing. Got intimidation in both, and perform is basically the same thing. However, I would say perform in 5th edition is just slightly more limited than it is in 3rd, because in 3rd edition it encompasses all musical instruments, storytelling, acting, everything like that. Well, in 5th edition, musical instruments, those are generally a dexterity check. You don't even have a skill to cover the playing of musical instruments. It would be what's called a tool proficiency in 5th edition. In 3rd edition, all performance is charisma, whether you are playing the piano, playing the guitar, public speaking, acting, all that stuff is a perform skill, and they're individual perform skills in 3rd edition. So you might have a skill in pianos or keyboard instruments. That would be a separate skill from public speaking, which would again be a separate skill from acting or from playing a guitar. Those are all separate skills that have to be built up individually in 3rd edition. In 5th edition, you just have perform, which is your ability to captivate an audience, but then the actual playing of a musical instrument is more dexterity-based and is not even considered a skill. So there is some difference between the perform skills in 5th and 3rd edition. However, we then have the final skill in 5th edition is persuasion, and that's basically diplomacy in 3rd edition. It also encompasses most of the other checks that are not skill checks in 3rd. Those other checks to influence others will usually be a persuasion check in 5th edition and not separate as they are in 3rd. And you'll note there are still 3 skills on the 3rd edition list that are not covered by the 4 skills in 5th edition. These are gather information, handle animal, and use magic device. Now, handle animal, as we've seen, is actually a wisdom-based skill in 5th edition. Well, what about the gather information and use magic device? Well, in 5th edition, after we list the 4 skills, it mentions these other 2 things of knowing who the best person to talk to is, and in kind of insinuating yourself into a crowd to hear the local gossip. Those things would be the gather information skill from 3rd edition. However, I would say that I never used gather information in 3rd edition, and I would probably not use these two ideas from 5th, because I prefer these things to be role-played by the players rather than just having it be a check of the die. And while I can see this kind of as a way to give a hint to players, I would still not make it a check of the die. I would just have it, if they needed a hint, we give it to them. So these kind of things, I think, kind of detract from the role-playing aspects of the game, but they are here. Gather information is a skill that can be learned and developed, while in 5th edition, the same basic concept is just a straight charisma check. So the last skill, use magic device, in 3rd edition, has no equivalent in 5th edition. It simply doesn't exist. Now, finally, in 5th edition, we do list classes that use charisma as their spellcasting ability. And what we have here is we have the bard, the paladin, the sorcerer, and the warlock. Now, you'll remember the paladin in 3rd edition uses wisdom, but in 5th edition, they use charisma. You will also note the mention of the warlock. There's no warlock mentioned for any of the ability scores in 3rd edition, because in 3rd edition, the warlock is not a standard class. He's not in the player's handbook. They are in 5th, but they are not in 3rd. And on a final note, just so you'll note, one thing is missing in 5th edition that exists in 3rd. So we had our skills, we had non-skill charisma checks, we have casters that use it as their spellcasting ability, but in 3rd edition, it modifies your turn undead if you are a cleric or paladin. It has no effect on turn undead in 5th edition. In 3rd, it does. In 3rd, the more charismatic you are, the more power you have against the undead. In 5th edition, that is not the case. And there you have it. This is our comparison of charisma between 3rd and 5th edition. They're basically the same, very similar. They just are, anytime you want to influence somebody else, you're using charisma, whether that is through fear, deceit, or persuasion. It's a charisma check, and they basically are covering everything. There are a few things that 3rd edition does that 5th edition doesn't do, and the classes that use it as an ability score modifier are somewhat different, but the ability score itself basically does the same thing in both editions. And I leave that here. This is the last one in our series on the ability scores. By the time this is up on YouTube, the Patreon should have been launched, so please check us out there, Norumbega Dungeons, and see you in the next video.